Hello, welcome to Gentle Wisdom Tales, where you find real-life stories that touch the heart.
The radio had been silent for 27 years, and then, on a Tuesday that smelled like cardboard and dust, it spoke. Thomas Reed stood in the middle of his mother's living room with packing paper bunched under his fingers and a strip of masking tape stuck to his thumb. The house was half empty, every surface showing the pale outlines where framed photos used to be. It should have felt like progress, another box sealed, another decision made, but the air was heavy in the way it got before a summer storm, as if the rooms were holding their breath. He hadn't meant to turn the old set on. He'd only meant to move it. It sat on the sideboard where it had sat for as long as he could remember, a wooden cabinet the color of worn honey, a fabric speaker grill stretched tight like a drum, two knobs that clicked with the stubborn dignity of things made to last. His mother called it the Philco, the way you might call someone doctor, with respect. Thomas hadn't heard it make a sound since the late 90s, after lightning struck the oak in the backyard and the living room filled with the sharp scent of burnt wiring. Now, he held the left knob between his fingers and turned without thinking, just enough to feel the old resistance, a hiss, a scratch, then music, thin at first, as if it was arriving through a long hallway, then fuller, clearer, the way a memory changes when you stop fighting it. A woman's voice, tender but certain, floated into the room. "I'm looking at the moon." Thomas froze. His hand stayed on the knob. His throat tightened so quickly he thought for a moment he was choking. It wasn't just a song, it was the song. The one his mother used to hum when she stirred gravy, when she folded towels, when she stood at the sink after everyone had gone to bed and thought no one could hear her. The one she stopped humming the year his father died, as if the tune had been put away with the suits and the condolence cards. Thomas looked around the empty room like he expected someone to walk in and scold him for touching it. But there was only the soft sound of the singer promising, "You belong to me." He hadn't heard that voice. Joe Stafford, he remembered suddenly, the name sliding out of the back of his mind like something oiled. Since he was a boy in the back seat of the family car, his mother driving, the radio on low, the windows down. His chest ached. He turned the knob again, carefully this time, to lower the volume. The music didn't lower. It faltered. The voice wavered, and then, in the middle of the word belong, the radio gave a sharp crackle and went dark, as if embarrassed to have revealed itself. Thomas stared at the dead dial. The silence that followed felt louder than the song. On the sideboard beside it sat a small envelope. He'd noticed it earlier in the day, but hadn't opened it. It was addressed in his mother's neat hand, Margaret Reed, 1963, like a label meant for a moving box. Underneath, in smaller letters, it said, "For Tom, when the house is gone." He hadn't been ready. He wasn't ready now either. But his hand reached for the envelope before his mind could stop it. And that was the first question of the day, the one that would keep turning in him like that stubborn knob. Why would his mother want him to open something only after the house was gone? And why would the radio choose that moment to play their song? He slid a finger under the flap. The paper tore with a soft, final sound. Inside was a single sheet, folded twice. A letter, creased with age. Not typed, not modern. Written in the same careful cursive, but the ink had faded to the brownish color of old tea. Thomas unfolded it and read the first line. Tommy. It was what she called him when he was small, before he insisted he was too old for it, before she stopped calling him anything at all after arguments that never fully healed. His vision blurred. He blinked hard and read on. "You might think there's nothing left in this house that can surprise you. I used to think that too. I used to think if you keep a room tidy, if you keep your chin up, if you show up on time and smile at the right people, the past will behave itself. It won't." There was a pause in the writing, a place where the pen must have hovered. "I am writing this because I do not want to die with my mouth full of words. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have found the radio, and maybe, God willing, It played what it was supposed to play. Thomas's fingers tightened around the paper until it creased. He looked at the Philco, silent and innocent, like a piece of furniture. The dial's glass window caught the afternoon light and threw it back at him. His mother hadn't been the sort of woman who talked about fate. She didn't like superstition. She liked schedules, lists, the exact time the roast needed. But the letter spoke as if she'd been waiting for a song to do what she couldn't. Thomas lowered himself onto the edge of the couch. The cushions sighed under him. There was another line, and he read it as if it might bite. There is a truth under that radio that you deserve to know. I'm sorry it took me this long. I thought I was protecting you. I thought I was protecting everyone. But I learned too late that secrets don't stay still. They grow legs and wander into the parts of your life you least expect. Under that radio. His eyes went to the cabinet. It sat square on the sideboard, heavy enough that moving it had always been a two-person job. His mother never moved it. She dusted around it. She polished it. She treated it like a shrine or a door she refused to open. Thomas folded the letter, not ready to finish it. His hands were trembling, which annoyed him. He'd been through funerals. He'd been through hospitals. He'd signed papers that decided his mother's care. He'd watched his own children become strangers in the normal ways children do. He didn't tremble, but he did now. He stood, walked to the sideboard, and placed both palms on the radio's top. The wood was smooth, warmed by the sunlight. The smell that came off it, old varnish and dust, was so familiar it hurt. He tried to lift. It barely shifted. The thing might as well have been bolted down. He went to the kitchen and found a rubber jar opener in a drawer, the kind his mother used when her grip began to fail. He slid it under the radio cabinet, careful not to scratch the wood, and used it to coax the radio forward, inch by inch, until he could see the shelf underneath. Something had been taped there, a thin rectangle, a paper packet, edges yellowed. Thomas's breath caught. He crouched, his knees complaining, and reached under the cabinet. The tape was old and stubborn. It came loose with a soft rip, and the packet slid into his hand. It was another envelope, thicker than the first, sealed with wax that had been pressed with a tiny pattern, a simple circle, a line through it, like a radio dial. On the front, in the same careful handwriting, it said, and beneath, a name Thomas didn't recognize. Henry Lawson. The second question arrived like a slap. Who in the world was Henry Lawson, and why had his mother hidden a letter for him under the radio for more than 70 years? Thomas's mouth had gone dry. He stood too quickly and swayed, gripping the sideboard until the room steadied. He heard his own voice, small and ridiculous in the empty house. "Mom," he said, "what did you do?" The envelope felt heavier than paper ought to. Heavy with time. Heavy with the kind of truth you only learn when it's too late to ask anyone to explain it. Thomas sat at the dining table and carefully broke the wax seal. The scent that came off the envelope wasn't just old paper. It was something faintly sweet, like the inside of a cedar chest. Inside were several folded sheets, and tucked between them, a photograph. It was black and white, glossy, the corners rounded. A young woman stood on a sidewalk under a streetlight, smiling at whoever held the camera. She wore a coat with a wide collar, and her hair was rolled and pinned in the style of the early 50s. Her smile was open, almost daring. It was his mother. Not the mother he knew, older, tired, careful, but his mother young, a stranger wearing her face. Beside her, half in the frame, was a young man in a uniform cap, leaning toward her like he belonged there. He wasn't tall. He had a grin that looked like it arrived before he did. His eyes were bright. On the brim of his cap was a small emblem that caught the light. Thomas flipped the photo over. Maggie and Hal, October 1952, outside WPRK, WPRK. The letters meant nothing to him at first. Then, as if some part of his mind had been waiting for a cue, he remembered a road sign from childhood drives through western Pennsylvania. A town, a station, WPRK radio, Parkville. The little station that had closed when Thomas was in high school, the building that had become a mattress store and then sat empty. His mother had been outside a radio station in 1952 with a man in uniform, and on the back, she'd called herself Maggie. Thomas's stomach twisted. His father's name had been Walter, not Hal, not Henry. He unfolded the first sheet. The handwriting was not his mother's. It was a man's hand, slanted and quick, the ink darker in places, as if he'd pressed too hard. October 19th, 1952. Margaret, I'm writing in the bus station because I can't think straight anywhere else. You can't just disappear like that. You can't look me in the eye on Saturday night and say, "Promise me," and then be gone on Sunday without a word. I stood outside your boarding house until Mrs. Givens threatened to call the police. I went to the diner and your boss said you'd quit. I went to the library and the girl at the desk said you didn't come in. Maybe you think I should know what I did. I swear to you, on everything, I don't. And then, below, a line that made Thomas's heart stutter. They played our song last night and I could barely breathe. Thomas stared at the words, hearing, in his mind, the woman's voice from earlier. I'm looking at the moon. Our song. He flipped the page. The letter continued. You belong to me. Do you remember when we laughed because it sounded too sure, too brave? Like it was a lie people tell so they don't feel lonely? You said, "Don't laugh at it, Hal. People mean it when they say that." And I said, "Do you mean it?" You didn't answer right away. You just looked at me like I was a boy asking for a cookie. Then you said, "Yes." I believed you. I still do. That's why this hurts so much. That's why I'm writing instead of punching the wall. They're shipping us out earlier than planned. Korea. I leave in 3 days. If you're angry, tell me. If you're scared, tell me. If you've changed your mind about what you want, tell me. I can take it. But don't vanish. Please, Margaret. Please. Harold Lawson. Thomas sat very still. The house creaked around him, settling. Somewhere outside, a car drove by on the street he'd known since childhood, the sound ordinary and careless. Korea. He'd known about Korea in the abstract, a war in textbooks, a word spoken in old movies. But now it was an urgent thing written by a man who sounded young and frightened and in love. Thomas found the next letter. This one was his mother's handwriting. October 21st, 1952. Harold. I am sorry. I am sorry. I am sorry. She'd written it 3 times, as if one wasn't enough. I don't know how to say what I need to say without turning into someone I don't recognize. I have been trying to be strong my whole life, and now I feel like a paper doll someone left out in the rain. I didn't disappear because I don't care. I disappeared because I care too much. Because if I had stayed and looked at you another minute, I would have run right to you and told you everything, and then I would have ruined your life with my selfishness. I am carrying something, Harold. Thomas's breath stopped. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know if it was mine to tell. I don't know if it's even true yet, but my body is telling me what my mouth is too cowardly to say. I went home to my mother's sister in Ohio because I couldn't bear to see the pity in Mrs. Givens's eyes, because I couldn't bear to hear the church ladies talk the way they talk when a girl gets herself into trouble, as if she did it alone. I wanted to write sooner. I wanted to call the station, but I couldn't trust myself not to beg you to come. And I won't do that to you when you're leaving for a war. Maybe you think I'm cold. Maybe you think I'm using you. I'm not. I love you. There it was. Plain. Not dressed up. Not hidden behind careful manners. I love you. And that is the problem. Because love makes people brave and reckless. It makes people believe in happy endings. And happy endings aren't something girls like me get when they aren't married. I don't know what will happen. I don't know what I'm going to do. I only know that if I asked you to choose me now, you would, and then you'd go to Korea with a heart that's too full, and if anything happened to you, I would never forgive myself. So I am making the choice for both of us, like a coward. I will keep the radio. I will listen for you when they play the song, and I will pray you come home safe. Forgive me. Margaret Thomas's hands had gone numb. He set the letter down and stared at the grain of the table, the familiar scratches from decades of family meals. He had always believed his mother's life began with his father. He'd always pictured her as a woman who stepped into marriage and motherhood the way she stepped into church, serious, committed, not prone to romance. But here was Margaret Reed in 1952, writing love letters to a man named Harold Lawson and telling him she was pregnant. Thomas swallowed hard. He looked back at the photo. Maggie and Hal outside WPRK, two young people standing close, the night around them like a secret. The third question landed, quieter but sharper than the others. Was Harold Lawson Thomas's father? He reached for the next sheet, but his fingers hesitated. He could feel in his chest the instinct to stop, to put everything back in the envelope and seal it again, to protect the version of his mother he'd known. But his mother had written, "You deserve to know." So he read. The next letter was dated December 3rd, 1952. Harold's handwriting again. Margaret, your letter found me. It took weeks. Mail crawls like it's afraid. I read it 3 times. Then I read it out loud to myself like a prayer. Then I sat on my cot and stared at the wall until my buddy asked if I'd gone dumb. I don't know what to say that won't sound like a man who thinks love fixes everything. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe you're right that the world is crueler to girls than to boys. But I'm telling you anyway. I want you. All of you. I want the life we talked about when we sat in your mother's borrowed car and watched the theater lights blink off one by one. I want the little house. I want the kitchen table. I want your laugh in the mornings. I want the baby, Margaret. I want the baby like it's my own breath. If it is mine, then it is mine. And that's not trouble. That's a miracle. If it isn't mine, well, I'm not blind. I know you had a life before I walked into that station. But you chose me, and I chose you, and I'm still choosing you now. Tell me where you are. Tell me what you need. I will come home and find you, even if I have to walk all the way from Korea. They played our song on the Armed Forces radio last night. Someone over here knows it, can you believe that? A kid from Detroit whistled the chorus. I wanted to grab him and shake him and say, "Do you know what that means?" But he didn't. He couldn't. Only you would. Only you, Margaret. Harold Thomas exhaled shakily. He could almost see this Harold, sitting in a hard place, writing with a stubborn hope that refused to die. There was another letter, this one from Margaret, dated January 1953. Harold, I got your letter. I held it in my hands for a long time before I opened it because I was afraid your words would make me weak. They did. I am still in Ohio. Aunt June has been kind, but kind doesn't mean safe. She looks at my belly like it's a stain. She tells me I should do the right thing, which means marry someone quickly and pretend. I can't pretend. Not with you in my mind. The baby is due in August. Thomas's heart hammered. He did quick arithmetic without meaning to, as if numbers could make the truth manageable. If the baby was due in August 1953, Thomas was born in August 1955, 2 years later. A strange relief flickered, and then vanished under a new confusion. So this baby wasn't him. Then who? He read on. I can't tell you everything yet because I can't bear the shame of it even on paper. I can only tell you this. If you come home and still want me, I will find a way to be yours. But I can't ask you to promise that when you haven't seen what this has done to me. I listen to WPRK when I can. The signal doesn't reach well from here, but sometimes at night, if I hold the antenna just so, I can hear Ray Whitman's voice like he's in the room. He played You Belong to Me last Saturday. I don't know if it was for us or if it was just the world being cruel. When the song comes on, Harold, I feel like my heart is breaking and mending at the same time. Please stay alive. Margaret Thomas sat back. Ray Whitman. The name rang a bell, faint at first, then clearer. His mother had mentioned a Ray once or twice, usually when old radio came up. Ray used to play the good ones, she'd said, turning down the TV when a commercial got too loud. Ray knew what people needed. Ray Whitman had been a real person then, a voice in their town, a thread connecting his mother to a time she never spoke of. Thomas shuffled through the remaining papers. His mind wanted a straight line. This led to that, cause and effect, a neat story. But the letters were not neat. Life rarely was. The next letter was different. It was not addressed to Harold. It was addressed to Ray Whitman, and it was dated March 1953. Mr. Whitman, you don't know me well. I am the girl who used to come by the station with library books and pretend she had a reason to be there. You were always polite and you never asked questions, and I am grateful for that. I am writing because I need a favor that feels too big to ask anyone else. There is a song you play sometimes. You belong to me. If you play it again soon, could you say before it starts, for Hal, from Maggie? Just once. He will hear it. I believe he will. And if he hears it, he will know I'm still here. He will know I didn't forget him. If you think this is foolish, you can throw this letter away. I wouldn't blame you. Thank you for the music. Margaret Maggie O'Connor. O'Connor. Thomas's mother's maiden name had been O'Connor. He remembered because it was stamped on her old school ring, tucked in a jewelry box he'd packed earlier that day. So she'd written to the DJ. Thomas felt the shape of something forming, like a picture slowly developing in a tray. His mother, young, caught between shame and love, a man overseas clinging to her, a radio station acting as messenger. And then, abruptly, the file of letters ended. No more from Harold. No more from Margaret. Just blank space where life happened. Thomas searched the envelope again, as if something might be stuck in the corner. There was one last item, a smaller envelope, unsealed, with Thomas's name written on it in his mother's hand. He pulled it out and slid a finger inside. A single slip of paper, a name, a date, and an address. WPRK Reunion Night, May 14th, 2026, Parkville Civic Hall, ask for Diane Lawson. Thomas stared at it. May 14th, 2026 was months away, but not far enough to be someday. It was a real date, a specific instruction. His mother had planned for him to go there. The fourth question arrived, cold and clear. Who was Diane Lawson, and why did his mother want Thomas to ask for her? He looked back at the silent radio. The Philco sat there like it knew everything and refused to say more. Thomas picked up his mother's first letter again, the one addressed to him, and forced himself to finish reading it. Tommy, if you're reading this, then I have already done the one thing I was always afraid to do. Leave you without being able to fix things. I'm sorry for the ways I failed you. I'm sorry I was hard. I thought hardness was strength. I didn't realize it could also be fear in a nice dress. You are not Harold's son. Thomas's breath left him in a rush, as if his body had been holding it. You are Walter's son in every way that matters, and I hope you never doubt what he gave you. But there was a child before you, a child I did not keep, a child I gave away because I was 19 and terrified, and I let the world convince me that love wasn't enough. That child's name was Anne. Thomas's eyes burned. His mother had never mentioned a child named Anne, not once. I have carried her name like a stone in my pocket for 70 years. I pulled it out in quiet moments and rubbed my thumb over it until it hurt. Harold came home from Korea in 1954. He came to Ohio looking for me. By then, Aunt June had sent me back to Parkville and I was working at the diner on Maple Street. Harold walked in one afternoon wearing his uniform like it was the only thing holding him together. I was holding a tray of coffee cups. My knees went weak. He asked me where the baby was. I lied. Thomas's stomach tightened. I told him the baby died. I told him there was nothing to come home to. I told him to go live his life. And I watched his face change in a way I can't forget. I did it because if I told him the truth, that I had given Anne to a family in Philadelphia because I thought she would have a better life, then he would have tried to get her back, and I didn't think we would win. I didn't think a soldier and a broke girl could beat paperwork and judges and shame. I told myself I was saving him more pain, but I was saving myself. Harold didn't yell. He didn't hit the counter. He just nodded like a man who had already learned the world takes what it wants. He said, "Can I hear it? Just once. Can I hear our song on Ray's show? For the last time?" So I went with him to the station. That night, Ray played it. He said, "For Hal, from Maggie." And Harold stood in the hallway outside the studio with tears on his cheeks like he didn't even know they were there. That was the last time I saw him. Thomas's chest felt tight, as if grief could be inherited. Later, Walter Reed asked me to marry him. Walter was kind, steady, not the kind of man who makes you feel like your heart is on fire, but the kind who brings you water when you've been burned. I married him because I needed a life, and because I wanted one. Because I was tired of being ashamed. I did love Walter. I still do. But I never stopped thinking about Harold. I never stopped wondering if I ruined him. I kept the radio because it kept the only honest message I ever sent. For Hal, from Maggie. I could never say it out loud again without it breaking something. If you go to the reunion night in May, you will meet Diane Lawson. She is Harold's daughter. Thomas's throat tightened so hard he had to swallow twice. Harold had a daughter. He had a whole life. I found Diane 2 years ago through a list Ray kept. Diane knows Harold's story, but she doesn't know mine. I did not have the courage to tell her while I was alive because I didn't want you to watch me be judged. I am asking you, Tommy, to do the brave thing I couldn't. Tell her. Tell her the truth about Anne. Tell her I was a coward, and I was also a girl doing her best with a world that wasn't gentle. And then, if you can, forgive me. Love, always. Mom Thomas set the letter down and stared at the table until the words stopped swimming. Anne, a sister. Older by 2 years, born and given away. Plus, Thomas tried to picture his mother pregnant before his father existed in their story. It didn't fit. His mind resisted. But the letters didn't lie. He looked at the photograph again. Maggie and Hal, young and bright. A world away from the mother he'd known. And somewhere in Philadelphia, a woman named Anne, if she still went by that name, had grown up without knowing she had a mother who listened to a radio and a brother who packed up a house full of silence. Thomas rubbed his face with both hands. His palms smelled like old paper and dust. The fifth question formed, heavy and unavoidable. What happened to Anne? And beneath it, another, quieter one. What would it do to a person to learn at 70 years old that his life had begun in a family built on a lie meant to protect someone else? He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the yard where his father used to mow the lawn in straight lines, proud of his stripes. His father, Walter Reed, had been a man of simple habits. He'd whistled when he shaved. He'd called Thomas sport until Thomas rolled his eyes and pretended to hate it. He'd died with his hand in Thomas's. Walter had never hinted at secrets, unless he was so steady because he was holding something down. Thomas turned back to the table and looked at the letters again. His mother had lied to Harold. She'd said the baby died, and Harold had believed her. Thomas wondered what that did to a man, what it did to the daughter he later had, what it did to the way he loved, the way he trusted. Thomas glanced at the small slip of paper again. WPRK Reunion Night, May 14th, 2026. Ask for Diane Lawson. His mother had chosen a date, a place, a moment where the past would open its mouth. Thomas had spent his whole life avoiding messy conversations. He'd been a decent husband, a decent father, a decent son in the ways that were easy to define. But he wasn't a man who dug for trouble. Now trouble had been taped under a radio. He folded the letters carefully and put them back in their envelope. His hands shook less now. Shock had a way of turning into purpose if you let it. He looked at the Philco. The radio sat in silence again, as if it had done its part. Thomas reached for the knob one more time and turned it, just to see if the song would return. Nothing. Only a faint static, like breath held back. "All right," he murmured, not sure who he was talking to. "All right." He went back to packing, but every time he taped a box, He felt the weight of that envelope weighting like a stone in his pocket. Over the next few weeks, Thomas did what he always did when he didn't know how to feel. He got practical. He sold the couch. He labeled the kitchen boxes. He hired an estate sale company that spoke brightly about mid-century charm as they priced his parents' wedding china like it was an antique treasure instead of a life he'd watched unfold. In the evenings, he sat in his own small townhouse across town. His wife's quilts folded over the chair, his grown daughter's old school photos still on the mantel, and he read the letters again. The words changed each time. At first, they were just a shock. Then they became people. Harold's stubborn hope, Margaret's fear, Ray Whitman's silent kindness. The more Thomas read, the more he realized the letters weren't a romance novel. They were two young people doing their best in a time that rewarded men for leaving and punished women for staying. Thomas found himself watching old news clips on his laptop late at night, learning about the Korean War in a way he'd never bothered to before. He read about soldiers shipped overseas with little warning, about families waiting at home, about young women who were expected to be pure and quiet and grateful. He also found himself listening for "You Belong to Me." He hadn't realized how often the world played it. At the grocery store, faintly over the speakers in the produce aisle, in a commercial for a nostalgia radio station, in an old movie playing in the background at a diner. Every time he heard those first lines, his chest tightened. Sometimes he thought he heard his mother humming along in the kitchen. Sometimes he thought he heard his father whistling from the hallway. One night he pulled the Philco into his own living room. He'd wrapped it in a blanket and carried it like a sleeping child. He set it on a table and stared at it. The radio had been his mother's witness. It had held her message when she couldn't speak it. But it was broken, and now so was he, in a way. Thomas found the number for a repair shop he'd passed on a busy street downtown. The sign in the window said, in faded gold letters, "Ward's Electronics. We fix what time forgot." He drove there on a Saturday morning, the radio buckled into the passenger seat with the seatbelt pulled snug across its wooden belly. Inside, the shop smelled like solder and old magazines. Shelves were stacked with radios and record players and televisions with rounded corners. A bell above the door jingled. A woman behind the counter looked up. She wasn't young, maybe late 50s, hair pinned back, glasses on a chain, but her eyes were sharp and kind. "What can I do for you?" she asked. Thomas cleared his throat. "It's an old radio." She smiled like she'd heard that 1,000 times. "Let's see." He set the Philco on the counter with care. The woman's expression softened as her hands moved over it. "Well, hello," she murmured, like greeting an old friend. "They don't make them like this anymore. Philco 48-200, I think." Thomas blinked. "You can tell that just by looking?" She tapped the wood lightly. "You spend enough years with old machines, you start to recognize them the way you recognize faces." She looked up at him. "This belonged to you?" "My mother," Thomas said. It made noise the other day. A song. Then nothing." Her eyes flicked to him. Something like curiosity. Something like caution. "A song, huh?" Thomas swallowed. "Can you fix it?" The woman nodded slowly. "Most likely. Could be a tube, could be wiring, might need a full recap." She paused. "Do you know what station it was playing?" Thomas hesitated. "I'm not sure. It was old music." Her gaze lingered on him. "Sometimes these sets pick up the strangest things," she said, as if that explained more than she was willing to say. She picked up a form and slid it toward him. "Name?" "Thomas Reed." She wrote it down. "Phone number?" He gave it. She wrote. Then she looked at the radio again, her fingers tracing the dial window. "Where'd your mother keep this?" she asked casually. "In her living room. Same place forever." The woman nodded, her mouth tight in thought. "All right, Mr. Reed. Leave it with me. I'll call you when I know what we're dealing with." Thomas turned to go, then stopped. How long? She shrugged. Depends how stubborn it is. He almost laughed, because that was exactly how he would have described his mother. On the drive home, he found himself watching the street signs as if they might point him somewhere else, somewhere back into 1952, to a young woman standing outside a radio station. He had the letters in his jacket pocket, folded carefully. He hadn't told anyone, not his daughter, not his son, not his friends. It felt like a secret that wasn't his to share, and yet his mother had handed it to him like a baton. In early March, the repair shop called. "Mr. Reed, this is Ward's Electronics." Thomas sat up straighter on his couch. "Yes." "It's Clara Ward," the woman said. "Your radio's interesting." Thomas's stomach tightened. "Interesting how?" "Well," Clara said, and Thomas could hear paper rustling like she was consulting notes. "It needed the usual. Old capacitors shot, wiring brittle. But there's something else." Thomas's fingers dug into the fabric of the couch. "What?" Clara paused, and in that pause Thomas heard something else, a faint crackle, like a radio signal trying to break through. "I don't want to sound crazy," Clara said carefully, "but when I had it on my bench last night, it picked up a station that shouldn't be there." Thomas's mouth went dry. "What do you mean?" "I mean it sounded like a live broadcast from long ago. I know that's impossible. But I've been doing this 40 years, and I know the difference between a nostalgia station playing old recordings and something that sounds like it's happening right now, with the hum and the room tone and the little pauses." Thomas's heart thudded. "What did it say?" Clara hesitated. "It said, 'This one's for Hal, from Maggie.'" Thomas's knees went weak. He gripped the phone tighter. Did you hear the song?" "Yes," Clara said softly. "I did." Thomas swallowed hard. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because," Clara said, and her voice changed, less professional, more human. "My father worked at WPRK. He used to talk about Ray Whitman like he was a saint, and he used to talk about a girl named Maggie who kept showing up at the station with her hair pinned just so and her eyes full of trouble." Thomas closed his eyes. The room tilted. Clara continued. "When I heard those names through that old Philco, I thought maybe this radio is tied to something, to someone." Thomas's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Clara sighed. "Look, I don't want to spook you. The radio is working now. It plays regular stations fine. But I figured you ought to know what I heard." Thomas's voice came out hoarse. "Thank you." There was a beat of silence. Then Clara said, "Are you going to the reunion night in May?" Thomas's breath caught. "How?" "My father's been gone 10 years, Clara said, "but I'm on the committee. We're trying to raise money to restore the old station building. I saw your mother's name on a list of former volunteers, Margaret O'Connor. I wondered if you were related." Thomas's hand trembled. "She was my mother." Clara's voice softened. "Then you should come. There are people who remember, and there are things that, well, things that might make sense there." Thomas swallowed. "I'll pick up the radio." "Any time," Clara said. Then, quieter. "Mr. Reed, if you have questions, you're not the only one." He hung up and sat staring at his blank television screen, his own reflection faint in the glass. The sixth question settled in him like a low note. If the radio could pull a voice from the past, what else might still be waiting to be heard? When Thomas went to pick up the Philco, Clara met him at the counter with the set already wrapped in a blanket. "It's safer this way," she said. Thomas nodded, unable to trust his own voice. Clara watched him for a moment, then reached under the counter and pulled out a small cardboard box. She placed it in front of him. "What's this?" Thomas asked. Clara hesitated. "When I opened the back panel, there was something tucked inside. Not part of the radio. Someone put it there." Thomas's pulse quickened. "What kind of something?" "A little metal tin," Clara said. "Like for mints. It was wedged behind the speaker." Thomas's mouth went dry. He stared at the box. Clara nudged it toward him. "I didn't open it," she said. "Didn't feel right." Thomas's hands hovered over the box. His fingers felt clumsy, too big. He opened the lid. Inside was a tin the size of his palm, dull silver. The hinge squeaked faintly as he lifted it. Inside were three things: a small key, a folded note, and a tiny strip of paper that looked like it had been torn from something larger. Thomas unfolded the note first. It was in his mother's handwriting. "If the radio starts talking when it shouldn't, don't be afraid. It's only the truth finding its way through." The words made Thomas's scalp prickle. He unfolded the torn strip next. It looked like the corner of an official document, with typed lines and a faint seal. There was a number, a -1739, and the words, "Adoption Record, Philadelphia County." Thomas's breath caught. He looked up at Clara, who watched him with a careful, sympathetic expression. "I figured," she said quietly, "you'd want that." Thomas's voice came out thin. This is about my mother." Clara nodded slowly. "My father used to say Ray kept everything, notes, letters, old records. He said Ray believed people would come back for their own history someday." Thomas stared at the adoption record scrap, his heart pounding. "What does the key go to?" Clara pointed to the tin. "It was taped to the inside. I don't know, but it felt important." Thomas closed the tin and put it back in the box. He wrapped his fingers around it like he could keep the past from spilling out if he held it tight enough. On the drive home, he thought about the key rattling softly in the tin. He thought about a door somewhere that had been locked for decades. At home, he pulled out the letters again and searched through the envelope, looking for any hint. Nothing. He sat at his kitchen table and stared at the key. It was small, brass, worn at the teeth. He tried it in his front door. Too small. In a desk drawer. Too small. In a filing cabinet. Too small. He sat back, frustrated, and then his eyes drifted to a small wooden box on a shelf, his mother's. He'd brought it home without thinking, along with a few other keepsakes, because it felt wrong to leave it in an empty house. The box was locked. Thomas hadn't tried to open it. It felt like trespassing. Now, with the key in his hand, the trespass felt like an invitation. He took the box down and set it on the table. The lock was tarnished. His mother's fingers must have touched it 1,000 times. Thomas slid the key in. It fit. He turned. The lock clicked open with a small sound that felt louder than it should have in the quiet kitchen. Thomas lifted the lid. Inside were a few ordinary things: an old rosary, a handkerchief embroidered with M.O., a small stack of photos. But beneath them, at the bottom, was a thin folder tied with ribbon. Thomas's hands shook as he untied the ribbon. Inside the folder was an adoption file. Not the whole thing, just copies, some pages missing, corners worn, but enough to make Thomas's skin go cold. There was a form with the date, September 1953. There was a line that said, "Mother's name, Margaret O'Connor." There was a blank space where father's name should be, and there was a new name on another page, written in tidy handwriting. Child's name at adoption, Anne Marie O'Connor. Adoptive parents, Mr. and Mrs. James Klein. Address, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Thomas stared at the names until they blurred. Anne Marie O'Connor, James Klein. A woman somewhere had lived a life under the name Klein, not knowing the name O'Connor belonged to her. Thomas's chest tightened with something he couldn't name. Grief, anger, awe, all of it. He flipped through the pages again. Near the back, clipped to a sheet, was a letter, typed, official. The Klein request no further contact. Closed adoption. Thomas's mouth went dry. His mother had tried to find her. Or at least, she'd kept the records like a map she was too afraid to follow. Thomas leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. He thought of his mother, standing at the sink in the quiet house, humming the tune she never explained. He thought of her hard tone when he brought home bad grades, as if she needed control because somewhere, long ago, she had lost it. He thought of how she'd avoided certain questions, how she'd shut down any talk of what if. He thought of Harold Lawson, standing in a hallway outside a radio studio with tears on his cheeks, believing his baby was dead. Thomas's hands curled into fists on the table. "Why didn't you tell me?" he whispered to the empty room. No answer came. But the Philco sat in the corner now, restored, and for the first time in decades, Thomas felt like the house he lived in wasn't the only place with walls. His family story had been built like a room with no windows, and now someone had opened the door. Over the next month, Thomas did something he hadn't done in years. He asked for help. Not from his children, not yet, but from paperwork and phone calls and librarians, the kinds of help that felt safer than emotion. He called the Philadelphia Department of Records and learned what he already suspected. Closed adoption meant closed doors. The file would not simply be handed to him because he wanted it. He tried anyway. He wrote letters. He filled out forms. He mailed copies of his mother's death certificate. He waited for responses that came back polite and firm. No. He sat at his kitchen table with the rejection letters and felt something like helplessness. It was unfamiliar. He wasn't used to being told a door could not be opened if he pushed hard enough. One afternoon, he drove to a small library downtown and asked the reference librarian, a young man with kind eyes, about adoption searches. The librarian leaned in and lowered his voice as if discussing something scandalous. "There are reunion registries," he said, "and DNA testing is a thing now. A lot of people find relatives that way." Thomas stared at him. DNA. The word felt modern and invasive. "I'm 70, Thomas said, as if that answered everything. The librarian shrugged gently. "So are some of the people looking," he said. "You'd be surprised." Thomas left with pamphlets and a knot in his stomach. That night, he sat in front of his computer and stared at a DNA testing website like it was a confession booth. He imagined spitting into a tube and mailing it away. He imagined strangers in a database tied to him by invisible threads. He imagined Anne. If she was alive, she'd be 72. She might have children, grandchildren. Thomas thought of his own son, Mark, who barely returned calls. His daughter, Lisa, who tried hard to be close but didn't know what to do with his silences. His wife, Carol, gone 5 years now, who used to press her hand to his chest and say, "You hold things in like you're afraid they'll spill out." He hadn't told Carol about any of this. He'd never known. He clicked order. The confirmation email arrived in seconds. The modern world didn't make you wait for decisions. It let you make them quickly and regret them later. In the meantime, he listened to the radio. Not the Philco. At first he couldn't bear to turn it on, but a small modern set in his kitchen while he made coffee. He found oldies stations. He found talk shows. He even found a late-night program on public radio where people called in with stories like confessions offered to strangers. Sometimes he turned the Philco on late at night when the house was quiet. He sat close, as if proximity mattered, and carefully tuned. Mostly he got static. Sometimes a faint station. Nothing special. And then, on a night in April, when rain tapped the windows and the world felt small, the Philco crackled and a voice came through, warm and low. "Good evening, Parkville," the voice said. "This is Ray Whitman, and you're listening to Saturday Night Serenade." Thomas's blood went cold. The voice sounded like a recording, but it also sounded alive, like a man leaning toward a microphone, smiling at the thought of people listening in kitchens and bedrooms. Thomas held his breath. Ray continued, "We've got a request tonight from someone who didn't sign their name. Just a note that says, 'For Hal, from Maggie.'" Thomas's eyes burned. "And Maggie," Ray said, his voice softening, "if you're out there listening, well, you know what you know." The record crackled, and then the first notes of "You Belong to Me" floated into Thomas's living room. Thomas sat perfectly still, his hand hovering over the knob, afraid to move, afraid to break the signal. The song filled the room, and for a few minutes, Thomas felt like he was eavesdropping on ghosts. When it ended, the radio crackled and slipped back into static. Thomas sat in silence. His heart pounded like he'd run a mile. He didn't know what to make of it. He didn't know if the radio was picking up some old recording rebroadcast somewhere, or if the world was stranger than he'd allowed himself to believe. It didn't matter. Not really. What mattered was that his mother's message, for Hal, from Maggie, had been spoken aloud again, and Thomas had heard it. It felt like a door opening. May arrived with the soft warmth of spring, and Parkville began to tug at Thomas like an old sleeve. He hadn't been back in decades. He'd moved away for college, then work, then life. His parents had stayed. He'd visited for holidays, but even those visits had thinned after his father died and his mother grew more private. Now, Parkville waited for him like a chapter he'd skipped. On May 14th, 2026, Thomas drove out early, the Philco in the back seat wrapped in a blanket, the folder of adoption papers tucked into a bag like contraband. The road cut through green hills and small towns, past diners with neon signs and churches with white steeples. As he got closer, memories rose uninvited. The smell of the river in summer, the sound of cicadas, the way the town seemed to fold itself into quiet at night. Parkville's main street looked smaller than he remembered, as if his adult body had outgrown it. Storefronts had changed. The old movie theater was now a gym. The diner on Maple Street still had a sign, but the paint was faded. He passed the building that had once been WPRK. It was boarded up, but the old tower still rose behind it like a thin finger pointing at the sky. Thomas's throat tightened. The Civic Hall was decorated with banners that read, WPRK, 75 years of Parkville's voice. There were folding tables, paper cups, a smell of coffee and sheet cake. People milled around, laughing, hugging, showing each other photographs. Thomas walked in and felt instantly out of place. He wore a collared shirt and clean shoes, but he still felt like someone who had walked into the wrong party. A woman at the entrance table smiled. "Welcome, name?" "Thomas Reed," he said. I'm supposed to ask for Diane Lawson." The woman's smile flickered with recognition. "Oh," she said softly, and then she leaned toward another volunteer and murmured something Thomas couldn't hear. A moment later, a woman approached from the far side of the hall. She was in her 70s, maybe older, with silver hair cut neatly and a posture that suggested she'd spent her life standing up straight. She wore a blue cardigan and a name tag that said, Diane Lawson. Her eyes met Thomas's, and something in her expression shifted. Curiosity, yes, but also caution, like she had been expecting him and didn't know what it would cost. "You're Thomas," she said, not a question. Thomas nodded, his mouth dry. "Yes." Diane studied him for a moment, then glanced at the bag in his hand. "You brought it," she said. Thomas swallowed. "My mother's radio." Diane's mouth pressed into a thin line. "Come with me," she said. She led him through the crowd, past old men laughing too loudly, past women wiping tears, past a display table covered in black and white photos of the station in its heyday. They entered a smaller side room where folding chairs were stacked and a coffee urn hissed quietly. The door closed behind them, muffling the reunion noise. Diane turned to face him. Up close, Thomas could see lines around her eyes that looked like they came from smiling and worry in equal measure. "You're Margaret O'Connor's son," Diane said. Thomas's throat tightened. "Yes." Diane nodded slowly. "I met your mother 2 years ago," she said. "She came to one of our committee meetings. She sat in the back like she didn't want anyone to notice her. But I noticed." Thomas blinked. "She never told me." Diane's eyes softened, just slightly. "She didn't want you to have to carry what she carried," she said. "Then she realized you were going to have to anyway." Thomas swallowed hard. "Did she tell you everything?" Diane's mouth twitched, almost a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "She told me she was in love with my father," she said. "She told me she let him believe a lie. She told me she had a daughter. Thomas's chest tightened. Anne. Diane nodded. Anne. Silence settled between them, dense and delicate. Thomas reached into his bag and pulled out the folder of papers. He held it out like an offering. "I found these," he said, "under the radio, in her box." Diane didn't take the folder right away. She looked at Thomas, as if weighing him. "My father died in 1999, she said quietly. Thomas's stomach dropped. He'd known it was possible. Of course it was. But hearing it out loud felt like a door closing. Diane continued. "He didn't talk much about before my mother. He was a good father in his way, but he had a sadness in him like a bruise that never healed. He kept a tin of letters in his dresser drawer, and when I was a kid, I once tried to open it. He caught me and snatched it away like I'd touched fire." Thomas's throat tightened.